Hello everyone. So today we're going to be talking about some Supreme Court cases. Thus far in Unit 6, the judicial branch, we have discussed the federal court system, the state court system, and the judicial process of how a case goes from an alleged crime being committed all the way to the Supreme Court. So speaking of the Supreme Court, we'll start talking about cases. Now that we have discussed majority, dissenting, concurring opinions, and how the Supreme Court chooses their cases, let's talk about some actual ones that happened. So let's get to it. Here we go. So we have got 16 cases in this first video and then 16 in the next. So for our first case is Marbury versus Madison. This is ruled on in 1803, and just a quick side note about the dates for all of these cases. The date they are ruled on is not necessarily the date when the first incident occurred. So many court cases take years, sometimes over a decade, in order to get ruled on, so don't let the dates deceive you. Alright, so let's get to the background. So essentially what happens is when one president leaves office, before it turns midnight on the last day of their term, they decide to try and stuff the federal court system with as many appointments as possible. Now, we know that federal judges get appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. However, this individual was like, I can go ahead and get the Senate to approve all these homies before midnight, and I can pack the courts with people that I like, because the president who's taking over after the first president was not the same political party. So one judge gets upset that he never gets his actual job notice, sues James Madison, and this nonsense occurs. So the background here is that besides the whole nonsense of court stacking and everything, the Supreme Court of the United States does not have the authority to both review and enforce cases. Okay, so the decision here is that judicial review is okay. So judges can look at a case and they can decide if it is constitutional or not. So many of our decisions in the resulting cases are going to say blah, blah, blah is constitutional, blah, blah, blah is not constitutional. So if you were doing this on the note sheet where it says article or amendment on the side, this would be Article 3. Article 3. So again, judicial review is established. They are allowed to look over other cases. However, they are not allowed to enforce their ruling. Okay? So they can say that something is unconstitutional, but they are not allowed to enforce it. That's the executive branch's job. Let's move on to the next one. This one is McCulloch versus Maryland. And as a side note, before I keep going, these are not going to be in order on your note sheet. Okay? So, McCulloch versus Maryland happens in 1819, or I should say it's ruled on in 1819. So, essentially, a national bank is created as a result of Alexander Hamilton's suggestions. He is our founding father who likes to duel and also has a secret gay lover. He had a lot of lovers. He was not necessarily just homosexual. He's probably the best way to describe him is bisexual. He just kind of was about everybody. So, anyways, he makes a national bank in order to get us out of debt as a result of the American Revolution. Now, a lot of people don't like the fact that we had a national bank, and Maryland, in a very bold strategy, decides to tax the federal bank. Now we know, because we're intelligent humans, that when state and federal levels get into a fight, federal always wins, and this is no different. So Maryland tries to tax the State Bank of Maryland. The individual who was in charge of the national bank at the time, Mr. McCulloch, sues the state of Maryland and wins. Okay, so the decision here is that the federal bank is supreme, and this would be Article 6. This is Article 6. On to the next one. This one is Gibbons versus Ogden, ruled on in 1824. So we're still in the early 1800s at this point. We will transition into the 19th century. Into the 20th century. I don't think I have any 21st century cases on the list, unfortunately. So these top 30 cases that we'll be discussing are the ones that are discussed the most with the Supreme Court, and the ones that most closely affect your daily life. Not necessarily like this one, but some of them do. All right, so the background here is that we have two ferry boat owners. One has a license from the state of New Jersey, and one has a license from the federal government, either New Jersey or New York. I can't remember. So they ferry people across the Hudson River every day from Jersey City to New York City. And so the question here is whether or not Congress has a right to monitor the seas. Okay, because every other, you have a state license, you have a federal license type argument that has taken place before 1824 and has been ruled on in a court has to do over land. Nobody has asked whether or not it's over water until this case. So the question here, does Congress have the right to monitor the seas? The answer here Yes, because apparently, as we know, when state and federal get into a fight, federal's going to win every time. So the decision here is that the federal license wins, and this is a result of Article 6, supremacy of the federal government. Our next one is Korematsu versus the United States. It is ruled on in 1944. It began circulating through the court systems in 1941. So some background here. World War II had been going on since 1939 when Hitler decided to invade Poland and was like, hello, this is mine now. And people in Poland were like, no. So World War II is raging on the European front over in Europe. And meanwhile, the Japanese Imperial Army on the Pacific front is also carrying on a full-scale assault and trying to take over all of Asia and most of the Pacific. Being as Hawaii is smack in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Japanese kamikaze pilots decided, as a result of the Imperial Army's suggestion, to bomb Pearl Harbor, which Hawaii at that time was a state and therefore made a deliberate act of war on the United States. So, as a result, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the time, in order to eliminate any potential threats of people being spies, decided to do the rather controversial thing of removing all Japanese Americans from the West Coast and forcing them into internment camps. So this guy whose namesake this case is, Mr. Korematsu, tries to dodge being sent to internment camps. He goes to the extreme lengths in the 1940s of getting plastic surgery to reduce the size of his cheekbones in order to look less Asian, so he would not be sent to an internment camp. Alas, he was then considered to be like on the run from the United States government. He was a fugitive. He was tossed into prison for a while. It was a lot. So he sues the United States Attorney General, and he loses, unfortunately. So the decision here is that the U.S. can stretch its power and limit freedoms, even the freedom to live where you want, during times of war. Now, since that time, that decision has been I don't want to say reversed, but it's been apologized for because it was not necessarily the most righteous thing to do. So this is a picture of a mess hall at an internment camp. They don't look particularly happy to be there, except for like maybe this lady in the front. All right, so then over here, this is what was hanging like on every light pole, every bulletin board in the town. Towns don't really have bulletin boards anymore, but they did in the 40s. So this is what this looks like to all persons of Japanese ancestry living in the following area. This would say like literally every neighborhood, they gotta go, which is a very sad and unfortunate time. All right, let's keep it moving. The next one is the Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States. So, in the early 1960s, we got civil rights going on. We're starting in the Vietnam War. There's a lot happening. There's riots in the street. The people are marching. Buses are being boycotted. A lot of turmoil is happening. All right, there are hippies around. It's a lot. So, this background, African-American family who is driving down the road on a road trip as a group asked to stay or go and like try to get a room at the Heart of Atlanta Motel, which is obviously outside of Atlanta, Georgia, which is the South, the super racist South in the 60s. And shockingly, they are not allowed to stay in the motel because of their race. So they sue the owner of the motel, and then the motel turns around and sues the Attorney General of the United States and says, I have a private business. You can't force me to not discriminate in my private business. Now, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act gets signed, which says that all public places must be integrated. However, he's like, well, this isn't a public place. But right in his face, the Supreme Court turns around and says Congress has the right to regulate private businesses to integrate. And this would be Amendment 14. This is this racist man in front of his racist hotel. That's no longer racist, or maybe even standing. All right, the next one is U.S. versus Nixon in 1974. A little background here. Richard Nixon at that time has been president for one term. He is going into his second term. He is running for re-election, okay? This happens, it starts in 1973 and ends in 1974. So he is super paranoid. He's also a Republican and decides to get two individuals to try and break into the Democratic National Convention's headquarters to see what the Democrats are plotting in order to get him out of office. Now, he was going to win anyway, but he just could not leave well enough alone. So these two fools get caught while they are trying to get out of the hotel, now that they have broken in and gotten their little strategy papers or whatever. And eventually it comes out that Richard Nixon has asked them to break into a hotel. Since that is an illegal activity, he was going to be impeached. He was going to get kicked out of office for his stuff. So before he gets kicked out of office, he decides to leave. He resigns. So he called them on the White House phone, full fool's errand number one, and then decides to take the tapes, because all of the White House phone conversations are recorded onto cassette tapes. He took 13 minutes of tapes and hid them and was like, I don't have to turn this evidence over to you because I'm the president. That's false. So the decision here, you must submit evidence. Nobody is above the law, including the president of the United States. At least that was upheld in 1974. So this would be Amendment 14. Everybody is equal in the sight of the law. All right. Because that is equal in citizens. The next one is Plessy versus Ferguson. We're flashing back in time just a little bit to 1896. This man on the left here is Homer Plessy. He is a 1/8 black man. He has one black grandma, and all the rest of his grandparents are white. One of his parents is mixed, and the other one is white, so he is therefore like an eighth black. Okay, so he is a, quote, black man. He sits in the white train car, because at this point it's 1896. This is post-Civil War. Really racist, really dangerous time for somebody who's even remotely African-American trying to live their life. He gets arrested, and he is kicked out of the white train car. If you were looking at him, you would not be able to tell that he was not white. He just looks very tan, has a little bit of kink in his beard. That's it. Okay? So he has to carry papers that say he is 1/8 black. It's a whole big deal. The decision here from the court, separate but equal. So having a white train car and a black train car in the first place is constitutional. Now, in the current times, we know this is not true, but in 1896, this was the ruling. This one would be, since the 14th Amendment does exist, you could say it's Amendment 14, but I would also say Article 6 for national supremacy. Next is flash forward a few decades. This happens is ruled on in 1954. So this is Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. So this is really 5 cases that were rolled into one, and these little children's are 1, 2, 3, 4, and then these are twins. So there's 5 families, and these are the children who were able to go to any school that they would like to, as far as public education, in order to receive an education rather than the, quote, colored school. This little baby right here is Linda Brown. She unfortunately passed away about 6 or 7 months ago. So she has got to walk by the white school to get to the black school every day, and they're separate places. You can't do that. The decision here is that schools must integrate, so all races are welcome in a public school, and separate but equal is not constitutional. This would also be the 14th Amendment. All right, and we are going to pause right there and pick up on our next video in cases 9 through 16.